All right. Well, welcome everyone. So it is our pleasure to have as our guest today Martin Indyk. So Martin is currently at the Council on Foreign Relations, but the book that he's going to talk about draws upon a lot of history, some of which he himself was involved in his prior roles as both special envoy, as Assistant Secretary of State, and as ambassador to Israel. And he kind of weaves together those features, so I'll tell you more about the book in a second, with a lot of, I think, novel detail that has not really been uncovered previously about Henry Kissinger's efforts in the Middle East. So it's a great pleasure to have Martin here. He's going to present about the book briefly. I'll ask him a few questions, open it up to all of you, and we will be done in an hour. So Martin, welcome to UCLA.
I'm not going to stand behind the podium. I know it's law school rules, I have to wear a mask, but it's very difficult for me to speak and project, so does anybody have an objection? If
I'm not even hearing that.
I'll stand over here, appropriately socially distanced. First of all, thank you, Cal, and thank you to the Nazari and Israel Center for hosting me today and for the wonderful reception that we had last night. Thank you, Alexandra, and all of the others who helped out. I'm delighted to be back at UCLA. I was thinking as I was driving up here that the last time I was speaking at UCLA was the day that US forces entered Baghdad and toppled the statue of Saddam Hussein. I don't know whether any of you were born in those days, but it was a critical moment in history. And here we are again, by coincidence. I'm at UCLA, and Russian forces are moving their war machine in the direction of Kyiv and other major Ukrainian cities. There's a difference, and I don't want to get into it because it's not my subject today, between George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq and Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. On legal issues, it'd be interesting to discuss and compare the two. But the basic point about Putin's invasion of Ukraine, an unprovoked, premeditated act of aggression, is that it upends a basic principle of international order, which is to say the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of states in the state system. And international order is something that Henry Kissinger prizes, has studied and written a huge amount about. And he, of course, based his approach to international order on a system of states and a hierarchy of states where the superpowers and the great powers and the regional powers were the arbiters of the fate of nations. Kissinger did not believe in ending conflicts, that it was ever possible to end conflicts and achieve world peace. What he believed was necessary to strive for in the system of states was the amelioration of conflict, was to create a balance of power, a term that you know about realist theories of international relations. Realists are always looking to create a balance of power, and Kissinger is the realist extraordinaire. A balance of power such that the balance is tilted in favor of those powers in the state system who want to maintain the status quo and maintain stability. And it's stability that is, in Kissinger's mind, the key to maintaining order and ameliorating conflict, and therefore achieving the greatest good for the greatest number. It's a very conservative attitude, and on the face of it, there's not much place for that other idea of peace or of justice, for that matter. And we can see how Kissinger's application of these kinds of ideas had some very positive effects on the international system. They talked with the Soviet Union, the opening to China, but had some devastating consequences as well in his effort to use force to achieve the end to the Vietnam War and the impact that had on Laos and Cambodia, for example. And there are many others. I chose to write a book about his application of his theories of international relations to the Middle East, and in particular to the Middle East peace process, which he, the American-led Middle East peace process, was what Kissinger had initiated after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And the interesting thing about that peace process was that at first, as Nixon's national security advisor, when he finally wrested control of Middle East policy from the hands of the State Department, at first he thought that he could maintain stability and order by supporting the Shah of Iran in the Gulf, making sure that the Shah had the strength with American weapons, a cornucopia of American weapons, to deter those that would disrupt the status quo in the Gulf. In the Arab-Israeli arena, the Middle East heartland, he backed Israel against the Soviet-backed clients of Egypt and Syria and Iraq. And this was the height of the Cold War. And he thought maintaining the balance of power in that way, plus détente with the Soviet Union, which specifically provided, there was an agreement made between Nixon and Brezhnev, that neither superpower would seek to exploit the situation in the Middle East and the conflicts there for unilateral advantage. In other words, both superpowers would act to maintain the status quo. And he thought that was enough to maintain order in the Middle East. To his great surprise, on October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria, Anwar Sadat and Hafez al-Assad of Syria, launched a surprise war on Israel on two fronts, Egyptian and Syrian front. In other words, his system for maintaining order broke down, much to his surprise. He moved very quickly in that war to negotiate a ceasefire, and after, I think it was 16 days, that ceasefire eventually went into effect. But it taught him an important lesson, that balance of power was clearly insufficient to maintain order. What was also needed was a legitimizing mechanism that would give states in the system a stake in maintaining that order. In the Arab-Israeli case, Israel had occupied Egyptian, Syrian territory, also the West Bank, the Golan Heights and the Sinai, in the 1967 Six-Day War. And there had been, in between 67 and 73, no effective process for addressing their grievances, their demand that they get their land back. And Kissinger, as a result of the breakdown of the order that he had been tending, decided that he had to find a way to give them a stake, at least the major Arab powers, a stake in maintaining the order and stability in the system. And the only way to do that was through a peace process, which addressed their grievances such that they would have a sense of justice, what he called a modicum of justice, so that they would have an incentive to split with the Soviet Union that backed them to make war, and instead turn to the United States, because the United States was prepared to use its diplomatic leverage on Israel to help them achieve their purposes in terms of returning land. Now, the basic principle of the peace process, and some of you may be familiar with this, was territory for peace, enshrined in UN Security Council Resolution 242, which was passed after the 1967 war, in which Israel would return to more or less to the 1967 lines that it had before the 1967 war. And in return, the Arabs would make peace, and with security arrangements to bolster the peace. That was the basic equation. To this day, it still exists in international law and in diplomacy, that the way to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict is an exchange of territory for peace. The poster child for this principle is the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, in which Egypt made peace with Israel in return for Israel evacuating all of the Sinai back to the international border between Egypt and Israel. So that was the basic idea in Kissinger's peace process, except, as I explained in the book and as was revealed in the documents, because he himself, in his 3,000 pages of his memoirs about his time in government, doesn't actually explain this, for reasons we can get into. He obfuscates it. But Kissinger didn't believe in peace. He believed, as I said before, in order. He thought that peace would come eventually in terms of Immanuel Kant's idea of perpetual peace. But it would only come after the powers had exhausted themselves. In other words, after they tried everything else, they would eventually come to accept peace and end their conflicts. But in the meantime, conflicts would continue unless you could maintain an order that ameliorated them, and therefore bought time for them to exhaust themselves and finally come to terms. In the Arab-Israeli case, his theory of the case was that there needed to be an exchange of not of territory for peace, but of territory for time. Israel would give up pieces of territory in exchange for time to exhaust the Arabs until they came to terms with Israel, time for Israel to strengthen itself with American support and its isolation, and by the time the Arabs were ready to make peace and end the conflict, Israel would be strong enough to give up more or less all of the territory that it had occupied as a result of the 1967 war. So that was his approach. He called it step-by-step diplomacy, in which Israel would take a territorial step, and the Arabs would respond with security arrangements, non-belligerency, things short of peace. And that's what he did very successfully. He negotiated two steps between Israel and Egypt. It's the Sinai Disengagement Agreement and then the Sinai Interim Agreement, in which Israel, first of all, withdrew from the west bank of the canal, which it had moved across into as a result of the war, and then withdrew from about one-third of Sinai from the strategic passes and the oil fields. 2 years later, Jimmy Carter took advantage of the agreements that Kissinger had negotiated to make a peace deal between Israel and Egypt, in which Israel withdrew from the rest of the territory. On the Golan Heights, a similar arrangement for disengagement between Israel and Syria, which he negotiated over 30 days. He was out in shuttling between Damascus and Jerusalem for 30 days. He made 19 trips back and forth. Inconceivable that the Secretary of State would be able to do that today. And he negotiated this disengagement agreement between Israel and Syria, which remains in force today and has kept the peace on the Golan Heights more or less completely, quieter than any other border that Israel has, including the one between Israel and Egypt, where there have been a number of incidents. And essentially, that arrangement, despite the fact that Syria descended into civil war, adheres today. Some 45 years, whatever it is later, it's still in force. And that was his approach, a peace process, not an end of conflict peace deal. And the order that he created in the Middle East as a result of that took Egypt out of the conflict with Israel, took Syria out of the conflict with Israel, made it impossible for any other Arab state to contemplate going to war with Israel. And so it worked quite well in his terms. Of course, the only thing it didn't do was solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. So when we, and I say we advisedly because I was a member of President Clinton's peace team, when the Oslo Accords were agreed on, and then we negotiated the Israel-Jordan peace treaty. But we, in the Clinton administration, and every administration since, has tried to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And all of us have failed, notwithstanding the efforts of 4 presidents. And that's why essentially I wrote this book, because I was in charge of the negotiations. I was a special envoy for the last round of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, which ended in failure in 2014. And I decided there's something fundamentally wrong with the way that we, the United States, are pursuing the peace process, that we keep on failing in this way. And so I decided to go back and try to understand how it all began, how Kissinger did it, and how his practice of Middle East diplomacy. And so what I learned from that is what I've just explained to you. But it was something that we did not understand, those who came after Kissinger, partly because he never explained it. And as a consequence, we all did what Kissinger fundamentally opposed, which was to try to aim for end of conflict, end of claim, peace agreements, when the parties were not ready. And so now, and we can go into more details if you like, but now we come back to a point where Kissinger's incremental, step-by-step approach is, I believe, the only way that we can put the Israeli-Palestinian conflict back on the path to a final end of claims, end of conflict peace agreement. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take an incremental approach rather than an attempt yet again to jump to the end game of a final status agreement which the parties are not ready or capable of achieving. Thank you.
Have a seat, Mark. Should we? I don't think we need microphones, so I'm going to lay these down here. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, so I thought we'd start, again, I'll have a conversation with Martin and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone. I feel duty-bound to note that since we're here at UCLA, in some ways, the peace process as we know it maybe began with Ralph Bunche and the work that Ralph Bunche did in 1948, 49, leading to some of the status quo issues that are still continuing today. And it's actually striking how much has not changed from the 1940s. But in any event, that's not your book. That's my book, but that's not your focus.
But he did negotiate ceasefire agreements,
Yes.
which were, consistent with Kissinger's approach.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, Bunche did not imagine they would last long. In fact, in the 60s, after the Suez Crisis, when they're still being invoked in the UN Security Council and places like that, he muses that he's amazed that they're still alive. He thought they were temporary, couple-of-year expedients. Of course, they lasted much longer. But let me ask you, so the core of your argument is this point about order and peace and kind of this paradoxical desire, or seemingly paradoxical desire to not aim for peace while appearing to aim for peace. And there's many dimensions to that. But one thing that I'd like to hear you expound a little more, and you noted the Soviets a couple of times, but of course Kissinger had a bigger canvas. So the Middle East was important to him, but he had a global canvas he was working on. And he was obsessed, really, with the Cold War and achieving order at the global level. So how does that fit in to the story that you tell in the book? And how does the Middle East in particular, some people, for example, suggest that Kissinger's main motive was maybe less order in the Middle East and more just keeping the Soviets out? Now, those are not inconsistent. But I'm curious to hear how you see those connecting, or not.
So, Kissinger operated at the height of the Cold War, in which the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union was intense, but he managed to kind of tamp it down through détente and through a series of quite far-reaching arms control agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union. In those days, in the Cold War, both sides recognized more or less the sphere of influence of the other. I say more or less because the Cuban Missile Crisis was a great example of the way in which the Soviet Union did not respect America's sphere of influence, and it almost led to a nuclear confrontation for the United States to make the point that Soviet-armed nuclear missiles so close to the United States was not acceptable to the United States. Interesting parallel with Putin's warnings today. But there were areas of the world which were on the margins of the superpowers' spheres of influence. And the Middle East was, I think, probably the most important one. Most important because if you look at your map of the world, the Middle East, that's why it's called the Middle East, it's slap bang in the middle. And across the major lines of communication, got all that oil there, and therefore it is the focus of what has become referred to as the game of nations, the great game. And the great game was in those days, was between the United States and the Soviet Union. The superpowers. China was still a rising power and really had no interest or ability to play in this sphere. The Soviet Union had been very successful in lining up the major Arab powers on its side with treaties of friendship and military agreements with Egypt, Syria, and Iran, the major regional powers on the Arab side. the United States, as I said before, was backing Israel, Iran, to some extent Turkey. But it really didn't have a position of influence in the Arab world, with the notable exception of little, small, weak Jordan, that really didn't count for much in the balance of power. And so you're right, Cal, that Kissinger believed that this was an area in which he could steal Arab states out of the pocket of Saudi Arabia. And he made it very clear early on in the Nixon administration that that was his objective. That sooner or later, he said in a press conference, Arab leaders would tire of their dependence on the Soviet Union, and then they would remove the Soviet Union and turn to the United States. And so his argument was, and part of the reason why he did not support the effort to resolve the conflict, was that he was trying to demonstrate to the Arabs that if they depended on the Soviet Union and Soviet arms supplies, they would get nowhere. The United States would back Israel, they made war, they'd be defeated. So it was a dead-end proposition for them, that the only way in which they could get their grievances addressed was by coming to the United States. And Sadat took Kissinger at his word and kicked out Soviet military advisors, some 12,000 of them, in 1972. Signaling Kissinger that he was ready. But Kissinger didn't pay any attention to him. He regarded him as a buffoon, somewhat like Zelensky has been regarded before his moment on the world stage after Putin's invasion. And so he didn't take him seriously. That's essentially why Sadat went to war. But once Sadat went to war, as I explained, Kissinger came in with this peace process. The basic purpose of it was to create an order and stabilize it by taking Egypt out of the Soviet camp and bringing it into the American camp, by showing that when it went to war, the United States would not allow Israel to lose, but if it wanted to get its territory back, the United States would work with it to achieve that purpose. And it was an amazingly successful effort in which he essentially sidelined the Soviet Union. Not only did Egypt turn on the Soviet Union, but Hafez al-Assad of Syria was prepared to distance himself from the Soviet Union as well. And by the end of Kissinger's time as Secretary of State, the Soviet Union was left with Yemen and Iraq. And the United States, that heralded in the era of American dominance in the Middle East, an era which is ending now, and as a result of American retrenchment. And the mechanism for maintaining America's dominance in the region, it's important to remember this, was the peace process. That worked very well until it didn't. And the decline of America's dominance in the Middle East started at the end of the Clinton administration with the failure of our efforts to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That setback then combined with the next thing, which was George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq and the opening of the gates of Babylon to the Iranians, led to further decline in our position of dominance, to the point now where it's highly contested. And in fact, we've had 3 presidents who don't really care to dominate the Middle East anymore.
Let's just elaborate that a little bit. So it does seem like Kissinger, as I recall, you spoke a little bit more last night about Kissinger's dissertation as a student, PhD student, which was about the 19th century and how that kind of laid the template that he would use in all of these settings, including the Middle East. And in that vision of balance of power politics that he so believed in and even revered, people like Metternich, that it wasn't, stability is a bit of a misnomer. It required active adjustments. There was a lot of adjusting happening all the time between the powers. So can we read from that one of the things that motivated Kissinger in his strategy of order rather than achieving an actual peace settlement or aiming for it was that, you kind of alluded to this, that the United States remains dominant because we constantly have to be actively meddling, maybe, or intervening in a more, it depends on how you want to word it. And that was both good for Kissinger personally, because he wanted to be the maestro of everything, but also was good for the United States because it made us Is that a reasonable thesis?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And the doctoral dissertation was published as a book. His first book was called A World Restored, Metternich, Castlereagh, and the Problems of Peace. Just as an aside here, the problems of peace. I mean, it was there in the subtitle, the skepticism of peace. But what he showed in that book, and it is a masterpiece, is the way in which Castlereagh and Metternich and Bismarck after him did exactly what you said, interfered, were constantly tending to the balance of power to tamp down conflicts wherever they arose. It's not that there were no wars, there were just no major wars. And that game worked for 100 years until the breakdown that led to the First World War, because the leaders that eventually took over didn't understand and didn't adhere to the principles of maintaining the order that Castlereagh and Metternich and Bismarck had pursued. And so that's his basic lesson from that book, is that the balance of power needs constant tending. But there's not much in that book about the need also to legitimize the order. That idea came later, and it's a critical component that many realists do not appreciate, particularly don't appreciate about Kissinger, that he understood that the order could only be stable if, as I said before, the powers that could affect the order had a stake in maintaining the order. They had to feel that the order was just in their terms, as well as balanced.
One of the things in our previous discussion you mentioned was that you talked about territory for peace as sort of the basic concept, but that in Kissinger's mind, I think I heard you say, this was yesterday, that he really thought in terms of time, and time specifically for Israel. And so, but at the same time, you said that he was surprised or didn't anticipate the degree to which Israel would use settlement building as a way to essentially destroy the prospect for swapping territory by making it impossible as a practical political matter to give the territory up, that he didn't see that coming.
No.
So putting those two things together, what did he think the time would buy for Israel? What was Israel going to do with the time?
So the principle of territory for time worked, as I said, in terms of the peace treaty with Egypt, in which Israel evacuated all of the Sinai. And it worked in terms of the Golan Heights in the way I explained. But in addition, 5 Israeli prime ministers during my time of involvement offered full withdrawal from the Golan Heights. So the principle worked there. Where it didn't work, as you say, was in the West Bank. And what Kissinger didn't take into account was that there would be a right-wing nationalist movement in Israel of settlers inspired by biblical justifications that the West Bank, Judea and Samaria as they called it, was the land that God gave to Israel. It wasn't Tel Aviv, it was the West Bank. And after the 67 war, and even more strongly after the 73 war, when they understood what Kissinger was doing, they deliberately went out and settled the territory to make it impossible for the principle to be applied there. And Kissinger can't be blamed for that. When he left office, there were, I think, 1,600 settlers in the West Bank. They demonstrated against him quite viciously during the 1975 disengagement negotiations, interim negotiations that he had with Rabin and Peres, who was defense minister, Shimon Peres. But that was about Egypt. They were protesting about giving up land in Egypt, giving up land on the Golan Heights. The West Bank wasn't in contention. We can go into a discussion about whether he should have paid more attention to the Palestinian issue. And I document there in a chapter about how he missed the opportunity. But in those days, the PLO, which claimed to represent the Palestinian people, Jordan was also making that claim. The PLO was an out-and-out terrorist organization. It was using terrorism to put Palestinian cause on the map. It was killing American diplomats in Sudan. It was blowing up American aircraft, taking Americans hostage. And so he thought that they should be handled by Israel and Jordan. But he always believed that the territorial component of the peace process had to apply to the West Bank as much as to the Golan Heights and to the Sinai Peninsula. And to this day, he supports the idea of Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank once, Palestinians are ready to end the conflict. But the cruel irony of his territory for time is that now it's almost inconceivable that an Israeli government could muster the political support to be able to evacuate those settlers. So it wasn't his intention, but it was territory for time was exploited in a way that contradicted his whole approach.
Okay, so we have time for questions. So just raise your hand. I'll call on you if you could just say who you are. I want to start there.
Sure. Thank you, first and foremost, for the talk and your time and most interesting case. My question is threefold. First, I was wondering if, in your view, the U.S. has been an honest broker in the peace process, and if that's not the case, as the observers have noted, has it been one of the reasons, one of the contributing reasons to the failure of the peace process that we discussed today? And my other question is also, if it's not the case in your view that the U.S. is not a broker in the conflict, should any state take on such a responsibility to try and foster peace between these two parties? Or should such a responsibility be reserved to institutions such as the United Nations, despite their shortcomings?
Okay, I've got two questions there.
Yeah.
Did I miss one?
No.
No.
Thank you.
So, the idea of an honest broker suggests that the mediator has to between two conflicting parties, has to take a kind of middle course or not take sides, and that's the kind of essential element of being an honest broker. But from the inception of the peace process under Kissinger, his whole strategy was to convince the Arabs that they could only get their territory back if they came to the United States to deliver Israel. And it was the US relationship with Israel that was critical to the Arab calculation of turning away from the Soviet Union to the United States. Why? Sadat used to be fond of saying, in explaining why he turned to Washington, that the United States gives Israel everything from a loaf of bread to a Phantom jet. Phantom jet in those days was the equivalent of an F-35 today, which the United States also gives to Israel. He was only exaggerating about the loaf of bread. But he understood the basic equation here. He turned to Washington to deliver Israel. And that is why every Arab state and the Palestinians have turned to Washington because of Washington's influence with Israel. And so the idea of an honest broker is misleading. We should be honest in the sense of conveying the positions of each side to the other in an honest way, something that Kissinger wasn't very good at, actually, as you'll see if you read the book. But in terms of being equidistant between the parties, that wasn't what the Arabs wanted. The Arabs wanted was for us to use our influence with Israel. And what they feared most, here's the irony, was a confrontation with Israel in which we failed to deliver Israel, because that would undermine the whole concept. That would show that we didn't have the influence on Israel. I know it sounds like upside down, but we're dealing with the Middle East here. And so that is the case. Even today, you see, with the Palestinians who are deeply frustrated by the American failure to actually deliver Israel in terms of their objectives and aspirations. Nevertheless, they talk about going to the UN, and they talk about going to the EU, and this comes up, time and time again. But in the end, they are always focused on getting Washington to deliver Israel. And I don't know whether you noticed, during the Trump era, when Trump was so in Israel's corner that he, far from delivering Israel, he suggested Israel should annex 40% of the West Bank. So, like everything else he did, he violated that basic diplomatic principle. Nevertheless, the Europeans would not dare to try to take an initiative with the United States taking that position, as much as the Palestinians tried to get them to do it. So it wasn't just the Palestinians that understood the basic equation, but everybody else did too. During those 4 years in which the United States under Trump dissed Palestinians, nobody else stepped into the vacuum. Nobody else. Because everybody had come to understand that it was only the United States that could do it, even when we weren't doing it. So I think that's just basically the structure of the negotiation, such that it's Israel's, it's America's use of influence on Israel that is critical to the lubrication of the process. And I detail in the book how Kissinger confronted Yitzhak Rabin, of all people, when he was Prime Minister of Israel the first time, withheld arms, pressured, took on the pro-Israel lobbying community in the United States. For 4 months, there was like a knockdown, drag-out fight in 1975. And he forced, through pressure, he forced the Israelis to yield to his demands. And what resulted was the Israel-Egypt peace treaty that Jimmy Carter negotiated 2 years later. That has lasted ever since and has been a tremendous, tremendous boon to Israel's security and Israel's well-being. So, if we look back with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that it can be done. Harder to do it today. And it can serve not just the interest of peace, but the interest of Israel in the process. So I think it's a very interesting case study in that regard. Now, as far as the UN is concerned, the UN obviously can't play the role that I described in terms of the United States influencing Israel. The UN has no influence on Israel. In fact, it's the other way around. Not the other way around. It has negative
Anti-influence.
because there's such an automatic anti-Israel majority in the United Nations that Israel doesn't take it seriously. Israel is so often singled out for censure, particularly in the UN General Assembly and the Special Commissions and the Human Rights Committee and all that stuff, that they're not going to listen to the UN. Nevertheless, the UN plays an important role, I would say a critical role, in terms of helping to support and police peace agreements when they're made, or interim agreements. So you have a UN force to this day on the Golan Heights, the UN Disengagement Observer Force. I'm quite sure none of you have ever heard of it. It's called Indyk. But it exists there on the Golan Heights, and it helps to keep the peace by kind of observing what each side is doing and reporting to the other. I have long believed, and have written about this, that the UN has a critical role to play in Gaza and potentially in the West Bank as well. The UN is active there. It has a special envoy and so on. But I believe that sooner or later, the United Nations will have to come in, support the building of Palestinian institutions, oversee the holding of elections, and creating the circumstances in which it becomes possible to actually do peace deals. I've argued for this before, the UN trusteeship in Gaza, for example. So the UN can play important roles, but it can't be an independent actor that can actually influence the situation.
I agree with everything you said. I would only add that it's interesting when Israel declares independence, in the declaration, there's a number of references to the United Nations in a very, very positive way. So the relationship is irreparably harmed at this point for many reasons, but it started off in a very positive way where the UN was a very active participant and viewed very positively within some sectors. Of course, the original UN mediator is assassinated, so it's not in 1940. So it's not a great start, but there's a much more positive start, and then by the time we get to certainly 67, that's it, long over. Other questions? Yes, right here.
Okay, so I do have a couple of points, but I will stick to two of them only. You've talked about Henry Kissinger opinion on how the peace process should be and how peace eventually would come. And I think a missing part, which also you've touched upon, is that the focus on territory is not enough in terms of the Arab people and Palestinians. There are many intersectional grievances, in the case of Egypt. Well, yes, they had their land back, but like if you go to the Egyptian people, they also have shared grievances with the Palestinians who did not get their land back. Moreover, it's not only about land, but now, like with the killings and the many blood that have been shed, it's really hard to say, like, well, get your land back, and then as if nothing happened all those like years ago. So justice is not only limited, I think, at least from an Arab perspective, to like land or territory alone, which also might explain some of the failures of the peace process. My second point is about maintaining the status quo or like world order, and I have 2 points on this. The first one is that while that might have been enough previously, I don't think, at least personally, that this is enough to keep up with today's problems. Just maintaining the status quo does not solve any of our existing problems and more increasing ones. Political ones, like military ones, to even like things as benign as climate change in the sense of like no one is fighting. And the second one is that when it comes to the U.S. policy in the Middle East, especially, so I'm from Saudi Arabia, so with the U.S. policy in the Gulf region, the focus on Jordan and Egypt and previously Syria might have been, that might have made sense at the time, but the power in the Middle East have shifted greatly. And more importantly, I think in the middle ranks at least, when it comes to policymakers and diplomats in the Gulf region, I think our perception of the U.S. as a reliable partner and ally is really shifting to the extent that many believe that to get what we really want and like have our say, we would have to stop depending on the U.S. and build our own coalitions, which might also explain some of the moves recently happening, both between like smaller countries and also shifting perspectives about Russia and China. So yeah, that's all.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think those are very interesting points. So I don't want to suggest that Kissinger has all the answers. Far from it. And what I wrote about in the book was about a particular period of time, historic. I said the Cold War was raging, and the geopolitical circumstances were different than they are today. Kissinger left office in 1976, so it was a long time ago. But nevertheless, I do think there are lessons that to be drawn from how he promoted the peace process that are important as we think about how to go forward. For Kissinger, as I said, the Palestinians were only a player insofar as they could disrupt his diplomacy. But he considered the issue to be one that had to be handled by Israel and Jordan. It was their problem. It didn't rise, in his view, to the level of an American problem as a superpower. As I said before, he was interested in the relations between states. He didn't recognize non-state actors of any kind. So I think that by definition, he wasn't going to be dealing with the problems that you allude to. You're right, absolutely right, that failure to make significant progress on the Palestinian issue led to a cold peace between Israel and Egypt, the Egyptian people feeling that Palestinians had been left That didn't stop Anwar Sadat. It wasn't going to stop Hafez al-Assad in Syria either. I mean, one of the things that's notable is that even back then, their concern for the Palestinians was very limited. And it's it's kind of abiding reality. And when the interests dictate, the Arab states will pursue, Arab leaders will pursue their interests, whether it helps or hurts the Palestinians. They don't have a veto power. They thought they did. They don't. You see with the Abraham Accords. Maybe they do with Saudi Arabia, but you would probably know this better than me. But I've noticed that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has started to adjust his position. He now talks about progress towards the solution of the Palestinian problem rather than the resolution of the conflict, Jerusalem and the independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. That doesn't seem to be his formula anymore. And so you're right, but it's becoming even less the case that relations between Israel and the Arab states are going to be held up as a result of a failure to move on the Palestinians. From my point, that's unfortunate, but I'm just describing the reality. Egypt and Jordan, having maintained a cold peace for so many decades, are now warming their relationship with Israel. And that's for strategic reasons, which apply to the UAE, Morocco, and Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia as well. But Saudi Arabia needs more cover than the rest of it in terms of the Palestinian issue, in my opinion. You're absolutely right that if you approach the world as a system of states, you are focused much more on the relations between states than you are on issues which go beyond borders. And climate change is a perfect example of that. And yet it still requires states to come together to take collective action. Unfortunately, as you can see, they don't do that very well because of their competing interests. But it is a fair critique of the order that Kissinger sought to create, that it doesn't take account of these burning issues that still have to be addressed by states, but have to be done in cooperation. His model was much more a model of conflict between states that have to be ameliorated rather than cooperation between states on issues that they didn't exclude it, but it was not his main focus. Your last point, I think, is a very important one. It's a telling one. That you said that the United States is no longer a reliable partner. And that is true. I mean, if you look at the in extremis situation of an Iranian missile and drone attack on a major Saudi oil facility, the Abqaiq oil production facility. And Donald Trump stood back and said it was up to Saudi Arabia to deal with it on its own. And that if Saudi Arabia wanted the United States to do anything about it, then they'd have to pay us to do it. A strictly mercenary arrangement. Well, that went to the very heart of the US-Saudi relationship and the compact that we've had with the Saudis. It goes all the way back to Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz. And it was, a basic compact. Saudi Arabia produces the oil, we protect Saudi Arabia. And the oil facilities were attacked, and we didn't protect Saudi Arabia. But it wasn't the only case of a sense of unreliability. Basically, Arab states and Israel, who feel threatened by Iran in particular, feel that the United States, we can't rely on the United States because the United States is now yet again negotiating a deal with Iran that would take off the sanctions and enable them to sell their oil, and they would therefore have a lot more money to do dangerous activities in the region which affect the interests of Israel and the Sunni Arab states. But that the United States has other priorities. The rise of China, Russian aggression, these are far more important these days to the United States than the Middle East. And that was underscored for them by the failure of Obama to enforce the red line that he himself articulated in Syria, and the shambolic withdrawal from Afghanistan. Even though Afghanistan is a little bit more remote from their area of major concern, it nevertheless sent a signal that we were leaving. We were ending the forever wars, and in a sense, we were not coming back because we were focused in other regions of the world. And so, yeah, the Arab states and Israel have reason to feel that they have to look elsewhere for their protection. And the only thing I would say about that is that hedging by depending on China and Russia is going to end up being an even less reliable security arrangement than the one we have with the United States. And that ultimately, your country, Saudi Arabia, is a very wealthy country sitting on a heap of oil, and it cannot defend itself, notwithstanding all of the money that it is put into defense. It cannot defend itself against avaricious powers. And in the end, it's only the United States that is willing to mobilize 300,000 troops and send them over to protect Saudi Arabia. So we're going to go through a difficult time in the relationship, but in the end, I believe that we have an interest in stability in Saudi Arabia and its oil coming onto the world market at reasonable prices. And Saudi Arabia has an interest in securing our support. But I think we're going to go through a period of differences, even severe differences, before we come around to that realization on both sides. Saudi Arabia now is in effect siding with Russia in its unwillingness to open the oil spigot and use its spare capacity to tamp down oil prices. And today, I don't know whether you saw this, but Saudi Arabia is now talking to the Chinese about denominating these oil sales in Chinese, remember, currency rather than the American dollar, which is a direct challenge to the dominance of the American dollar as the international currency. And quite sure that won't be appreciated in Washington. So things have gone awry in, I think, a major way, and I think both sides are to blame. We need to find a way to sort this out. I'm afraid it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Well, that is not a cheery note, but a very Middle East note to end on. So we are at the end of our hour. Martin, thank you so much for coming out. We have books. I believe Martin will even sign a book if you buy one. So
For free.
Thank you so much for coming. That was great.
Thank you all.